It's lovely to see everybody here. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have this event. We're excited that we collaborated with the Newman Center in terms of Father Sherman's lounge dedication downstairs. If you weren't here earlier for that, when we're all done, you should take a moment to walk into the lounge and check it out. It's beautiful. I wanted to say a special and also sincere thank you to the Friends of the Libraries for NDSU. Without their help, events like this would not be able to happen. So who's a Friends of the Library that's here right now? Raise your hand. Cool, see, awesome, thank you, most definitely. Thank you everybody for recognizing them. If you would like to become a friend of the libraries, please visit the libraries table in the lobby or right out here, right out here after the panel discussion, and you can get more information. So I also wanted to say thank you to all of the NDSU library staff and librarians that helped make this event possible. Because it was definitely a team effort and not just a small group of individuals. And lastly, but not leastly, if that's a word, I'm a librarian, I get an F for today. I would also like to say thank you to the staff at the St. Paul Newman Center for hosting our event, and I'd like to welcome the 14th director of the St. Paul Newman Center, Father James Cheney, to share a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to all of you. This is really a dream for us to be able to serve the university campus with events like this through our facilities. So thank you so much for choosing the Newman Center and coming over here. It's just hopefully it's just going to be something that's going to serve the students for the next 75 to 100 years. I came to the Newman Center in the 80s from a small dairy farm, and I did go to the library once in a while. But really unprepared for college. I joined the football team. I wanted to fly jets for the Air Force, and my first year at college was a disaster. And so I wound up coming to the Newman Center looking for meaning in my life, and it changed my life. You know, so that's part of our passion here. We just want to be able to serve the students for those really big, important questions in their lives. How am I called to make the world a better place? What's my destiny? What's my vocation? You know, great questions, 18 to 21, right? You know, so what an honor and privilege it is to serve what I consider to be a sacred time in a person's life. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming and welcome to all of you. And it's my privilege now to bring up Jeremy Kopp, and he's going to say a few words. So Jeremy.
Thanks, Father Cheney, and thanks for hosting us tonight. My name is Jeremy Kopp. I'm the interim director of the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection. I wanted to take a couple minutes just to briefly recognize and thank two people. First, a name you probably know, Michael M. Miller. Michael was the director of the GRHC he was the director since 1978, which was when the GRHC was founded, but he was a staff member at the North Dakota State University Library since 1967. He's the second longest serving NDSU employee. I personally have not had an opportunity to recognize him in public for his service and dedication to the community, so that I'm taking this opportunity to do so. If we could give him a round of applause. Michael really was the one who had the vision for this exhibit that you saw down in the lobby. Almost immediately after Father Sherman donated his photographs and his collection. It took us a few years to finally get to the point where we had the right people in place and the right funding in place to make it happen. We always knew that we wanted to have student involvement. Father Sherman, when he went out to take these photographs and do this documentation, he always brought students with him. And so we wanted to honor that legacy by also involving students. And so that brings me to my second person I want to recognize, which is Wyatt Atchley. Wyatt is a master's student in history. He came to work for the GRHC in 2021. Our initial discussions about this exhibit truly made it obvious that his career goals in this exhibit were going to line up for exactly the experience he was looking for. So really this event and this exhibit are thanks to Wyatt's time, research, and talent. Wyatt not only curated and researched the traveling exhibit that you see in the lobby, but he also created an online exhibit. If you've got all these on your seats here, there's a QR code that you can scan. There's also a link on our website, and everyone who attended tonight will get an email that has that link to that as well, including a recording of tonight's event as well. So these experiences that Wyatt got while making this exhibit are they're these hands-on experiences that we offer at NDSU. And he'll be able to apply a lot of these skills on day one in his career. So Wyatt is graduating in less than a month. So this is really the culminating experience of his graduate assistantship at the GRHC. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Wyatt as he introduces the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Jeremy. Is this on? Can you all hear me? Perfect. So, thank you for that introduction. Also, I'm glad to be up here with some distinguished panel experts. Together, we're going to explore some of the topics that we encountered during the exhibit making process. So these are some of the topics that we wanted to explore not only in the exhibit, the online exhibit, but also just questions that I think the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection is working towards adding research to. So allow me to introduce this panel. To my right, we have Dr. Tom Isern, a University Distinguished Professor of History at NDSU and a renowned expert in the history of the Great Plains in North America. Sitting next to him, of course, is Michael Miller, as you all now know. I'm sure very few of you don't know who Michael is, but he is a highly respected figure in the field of heritage collection, and he has dedicated 55 years and counting, because he still comes in almost every single day, even though he is retired, to the GRHC. He has been collecting and sharing the history of the culture of the Germans from Russia for his entire life. Sitting next to him, we have Steve Martens, Emeritus Professor of Architecture at NDSU. Steve has helped author numerous, probably countless, successful National Register nominations, and he has increased public awareness of heritage buildings and cultural landscapes. And last but not least, at the end, we are joined by Heather Fischer, accomplished architect and a professor of practice at NDSU, who has led multiple preservation projects in North Dakota, which I have been lucky enough to be part of a few of those. So we are going to start getting into this discussion here, starting with Steve Martens, if you'll just pass that down to Steve. And Steve also has some comments from Bill Peterson, the director of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us tonight, but wanted to say a few words.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. What a privilege to associate with old friends that I don't see often enough, and to have an engaged group of people that come out on a nice spring day finally to participate in this really worthwhile activity, this commemoration of heritage and culture and all the things that make living in our region really valuable. To prepare for this, I had an occasion, I just finished up a 2-year stint as president of the State Historical Board, and have to be in Bismarck every couple of months, and spent some time out there visiting with Dr. Bill Peterson, the director of the Historical Society, and we wanted to sort of brainstorm some things that maybe would be opportunities to support the mission and the activities of the German-Russian Heritage Collection. And Bill mentioned that he wasn't going to be able to be here today, and asked me to pass along some remarks to him, from him. Congratulations to the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection and the communities they support for the wonderful new exhibit and for their many years of vigorous support for cultural heritage preservation. Often my work as the director of the State Historical Society, I find myself considering what makes North Dakota stand out historically from other states. While I have come to realize that there are many contributing factors to this distinctness, there's one that I return to again and again. The people here are more cognizant of their history than in any other place I have ever lived. It's exemplified in the work of Michael Miller and the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, and in the new exhibit that you have an opportunity to see today. Michael, and now Jeremy and their collaborators, the Friends of the Libraries, the NDSU Institute Press, all are prime examples of what can be done when people are passionate about their heritage. In an age where historians are frequently urged to quantify their value in data sets, the GRHC has also shown the immense value of relationships. These relationships have enabled countless others to do a better job of historic preservation, including and in particular people at the State Historical Society of North Dakota. The State Historical Society appreciates the Germans from Russia as valued local partners, imaginatively carrying forward the mission of research, education, community renewal, and celebration of cultural richness. GRHC has leveraged the relationships it has built to assist the State Historical Society in the preservation, documentation of North Dakota's rich culture through our single homestead property, the Welk Homestead. Today, I offer a sincere word of thanks to Jeremy and Michael for reminding us just how important North Dakota and the relationships we have with our past and our present is. Naturally, State Historical Society remains eager to support and encourage your work and the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection's passions for carrying forward the bright torch of heritage celebration in the communities we all serve. So we should all feel blessed and encouraged after the 50 years that this heritage preservation effort has been ongoing, that we have an opportunity now to reflect back on some of those relationships. And the questions that were directed to me had to do with maybe the area of historic preservation. I suppose I've somewhere along the way lapsed into that being maybe an area of specialization for me. And what I was reminded of in preparing for this is the time spent with really distinguished humanitarians, people who had a knack for becoming part of a community and for touching hearts. I had the good pleasure to spend several lunch times and evenings with Father Bill Sherman, and the thing that I remember most about him is his patience and his quiet graciousness in maintaining friendships and relationships. He would introduce himself in a community, and the scholarship that he did was remarkable. The scholarship of documenting those farmsteads, it's world-class information material, but what he also took away from it was an appreciation for what makes those communities meaningful and worthwhile. And the time that I've spent with Michael Miller over the years, not enough time, not as much as we ought to enjoy ourselves, but it kind of continues that same pattern. I think if a person was going to emulate a way of being a researcher or a way of learning about heritage in different communities, it would be that characteristic of patience and being a good listener and really taking the time to reflect on the things that you hear from people who you meet. And then maybe one other person that I would mention that this is sort of a time where we're thanking people who have given their lives to these missions. Bob Dambach from Prairie Public Broadcasting, the collaborations that were done between Germans from Russia and Prairie Public. I hear from people all over the United States actually that have seen those productions, and they're just fascinated by what kind of a place they see North Dakota as being. So I knew that everyone here wouldn't want to listen to a bunch of technical stuff about historic preservation and historic building documentation. So I tried to kind of keep my comments or thoughts focused really more on what the purpose of this exercise is. And we could think in terms of two broad approaches to preserving. And I've grown to maybe talk less about preserving architecture, but it's really about preserving heritage. It's about preserving foodways and stories and folklore and past experiences and appreciations of landscape. And so if there are two approaches that we could focus our efforts on, rehabilitation and restoration require a lot of time and a lot of time and money and risk to do something to preserve the physical fabric of buildings. But happily, the kind of preservation by documentation that's reflected in the panels downstairs and really all the projects and the work that the GRHC have done, it involves a moderate amount of time and certain amount of expertise and communication and an inquisitive mind, but it has a prolonged learning curve. And so I think that's why we're at a point now where Michael has had the foresight to involve another generation of people in these experiences, these relationships that he's built all around the state over his lifetime and career. And I think that idea of passing the torch and making sure that those relationships are cultivated and continue, and it goes both ways. There are people now who are involved in those communities around the state that are served by the Germans from Russia Heritage Collections, and they come to this repository, to this center of information to learn about maybe things you probably, I bet I'm not the only person here who has that experience of having spent so much time listening to my grandmother's stories, and I just, that was the biggest influence on me as someone who believes in heritage, and wishing that I could hear some of those stories again. You know, we miss the things that we didn't pay careful enough attention to at the time later. And so, you know, I think the repository aspect of what the GRHC does, the outreach that they do to communities all over the state, and the exemplary work that they do as far as being the place that people come to as a clearinghouse for information. That is an institution that's been created that it has to continue. It really it's an important, it's an indispensable aspect of what how NDSU serves the state of North Dakota. I was reminded that, you know, preserving historic buildings in a physical sense happens against long odds everywhere. It's really a long shot. And so we're lucky that we have the opportunity of preservation by documentation, which we can all be involved with. We can start that process and collect stories from people and pass those along to the repository. So that option exists even when we're at risk of losing some of this physical heritage. And I thought the panels did a really nice job of explaining that, the inevitability that we do lose the physical fabric of these buildings over time. The philosopher and historian John Ruskin was one of the first to write about the idea that buildings obviously wear out, and that aging process is part of their life story. I was taken. When we were collecting some information on the Hoodmacher property in Dunn County, got to meet quite a number of local people there, and a lady who wrote a little poem for the remembrance of St. Edward's Church that once stood about a quarter of a mile away from the Hoodmacher property. She wrote, "As the wind moans and sobs around my aged eaves, I know my days are numbered. I can stay here just a little longer and look up at the quiet hills in the distance, and all I have left are the memories. Soon, soon, I too will be no more than a faded photograph, an echo of a song, a scattered foundation, a silent tear, a memory soon forgotten." So, you know, that way of seeing the things that we make in the world as being like the human body. It's like something that valuing and respecting that connection between us and the things we make and the places that we form community. That's our greatest legacy that we have to leave to future generations. So with that, is there someone else you'd like to call on?
Well, as we're talking about the sort of legacy of historic preservation, I think a lot of this has been about Father Sherman, right? And we've talked about how Father Sherman is really one of a long line of people who has led historic preservation and the preservation of German-Russian history. So if we could pass the torch down here to Dr. Isern, who can talk a little bit. He helped create the second edition of Father Sherman's book, Prairie Mosaic, and he wrote a wonderful introduction. So if you wouldn't mind giving some introduction to Father Sherman.
It was a wonderful introduction, and I really so much, I learned a lot of things from it, Tom. I reread it after quite a long time, and thanks for, it was really a nice piece of writing.
Those are really kind comments, and what I have to say is, it was a privilege to channel those things. You know, it came right from Father Bill, and that's part of the relationship too. Take them down and pass them on to who knows how many years of readers down the line. You know, I can talk a bit about, in particular, Father Bill and how his mind worked, which is a function too of his personality. And with Father Cheney sitting in the back here to get his attention, we would say he was, his way of working marked him as a good shepherd of the flock. There are other people that were involved in that republication of Prairie Mosaic, the second edition of it. One of them right here, and I'm not going to say another word about Michael because his head is getting pretty big here today, don't you think? It's swelling up, and I'm afraid it'll explode on me here. But down here, Dr. Suzanne Kelly, the editor and publisher of North Dakota State University Press, had quite a bit on it. And you know, it came about, why, you wonder how to get published in history. She was talking about having an introduction for this to set it in context and some appreciation of where Father Bill stands in shaping the knowledge of our region, and particularly of the ethnic cultures of our region. And a good quarterback calls his own number now and then. And I said, I have to write that introduction. And there are two reasons. One of them is affection for Father Bill. And knowing what he was about with that work. And the other one, well, let's just leave it at that. Knowing what he was about in that work. The other one was knowing of what consequence that work had. His research on the ethnic cultures of North Dakota. I hardly ever use the word unique, but it's something like that. We're talking about Prairie Mosaic, an ethnic atlas of rural North Dakota. And let's praise, first of all, that title, Prairie Mosaic, because it was written at a time when most historians of ethnic immigrant cultures, and most all of us in the room are fairly close to one ethnic immigrant culture or another, a high proportion of Germans from Russia, I suspect, in the room. But the old model was the melting pot, that people come into America and the old country disappears from their lives. It does not, partly because of this guy, but also because those roots live in our hearts. The original edition was 1983, in other words. And Bill was ahead of his time with this thing. It's a work of knowledge and landmark importance to historical knowledge, which previously to the 1980s consigned ethnic traditions, your family traditions about the old country and your ancestors. That was just kind of an antiquarian backwater. Serious scholars did not dabble in that on the Great Plains. In other countries they did, but not so much in the United States. They were obsessed with other things. But then a few people began to turn that. I would say there are three. Fred Lubke from the University of Nebraska, Terry Jordan of the University of Texas, and by God, our own Father Bill Sherman, who worked harder than the other two did at any point in their life. I had a sense of what Father Bill was about with that work, Prairie Mosaic. He had a predecessor. There was a fellow named Carmen, a foreign language professor, who had done something similar a half century earlier, but he didn't do the spade work and the groundwork. All those detailed maps, Carmen was kind of making them up. Bill did not make them up. He planted the data right in the map where it belonged. Where did all that data come from? And now, if you haven't looked at it lately, find one of Bill's maps here. Oh, here we are. Southwestern North Dakota. And all the shading showing rather precisely, no, darn precisely, where the different immigrant cultures settled on the land, right? A little bit different shading coding for each one of them. Maybe couldn't afford color coding at that time in publication, right? It was a fairly expensive item at that time. And it shows truly a mosaic. That's where the metaphor comes from. And it says alongside each map, Shaded areas are at least 95% of the same national group, unless otherwise indicated. 95%. How does he know that that area, that little shaded area on the map is 95%? That it's not a melting pot landscape, but that it's actually quite articulated as to who settled where. Where'd he get all that data? I can tell you. He started with the plat maps. Those of you farm background, you know what a plat map is. You can determine property ownership. They were proliferating in this part of the country in the early 1900s. Plat maps. Get one for your county. You'll find it an interesting proposition to reconstruct a landscape from that. But he just started with that. And then going down through the local histories, the local government records, field work, and cold calls with that ancient instrument called a telephone, tracking down the ownership of every single parcel of ground in North Dakota. This man and his assistants, Mr. Herrera, and all the NDSU students involved in this, they're calling strangers on the phone. Are you the descendant of so-and-so in section range township such and such? And pinning them down. And then going out to the field and finding them. Now, how is this possible? There are two great assets involved. One of them was person power, NDSU students who would show up in Father Bill's classes. Did you know so-and-so from Adams County? Did you know so-and-so from Stark County? And it proliferated that way, and they'd get suckered into the work of gathering all this data. The NDSU students were crucial to that. You're part of a big tradition there. And then working space in the old Newman Center here. Lord, I wish those maps existed still, but these small maps, page maps, they were big maps, like covering a good part of that wall there. And Bill and his assistants would get them out there and pin them on the map. And they'd get out their data and they'd start to draw those lines and shading on there. God, if those are anywhere in somebody's attic, get them out. We need those things as historic mementos. Working space in the Newman Center was a big deal for making that work possible. God willing, it'll be a big thing for the furtherance of knowledge from here on now, and to the power of three with a facility like this. How is this possible? All that hard work and long effort. The scholarly critics looked at this thing, and there were two types. One of them said, wow, think of the work involved in this. Our hats are off to you. The others, kind of social scientific scholars, said, oh, we don't do that anymore. We don't track down every farmer in North Dakota. That's just ridiculous. Take a nice little sample set and work with that and extrapolate from that. No, that would not do for Father Bill. Why? Because of John 10:14. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and I am known of mine. And so Father Bill wanted to know about every farm and every farmer in North Dakota because he loved them. Even the Lutherans, Wyatt.
Speaking of Father Sherman, for all the work he did, we wouldn't really have been able to do any of this if it wasn't for his and Guerrero's work back throughout the 70s, and it probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the GRHC getting hold of all of these photos, something that Michael grabbed up as soon as he could. So Michael, I'm wondering if you could talk about your relationship with Father Sherman, but then also about how the GRHC ended up getting this collection.
Let me tell you the real story about Father Bill Sherman. I came to NDSU in June of 1967, and was on a Friday. On that Sunday, I went to Mass here at the old St. Paul's Newman Center, and that's when I met Father Bill Sherman. This was back in June of 1967. But after Mass, of course, he was chewing snooze. And then he asked, where are you from? You got kind of an accent. And I said, well, I'm not Irish like you, but I'm German-Russian. He said, really? I said, where are you from? Strasbourg. He said, can I go with you down there sometime? Because I'm not sure, as a Sherman, they'll accept me behind the Iron Curtain at Strasbourg. So then So Father Sherman, he really mentored me in many ways. And that you have to remember that was in 1967, and the German-Russian collection started in 1978. But he always encouraged me through the class he taught on the Great Plains in North, what he would taught here at NDSU through sociology. He would always say, we really need to do something about these German Russians, and you need to remember them. You came from that town where all these German Russians are. So then that really instilled me. And then, of course, the collection started in 1978. But then one of his first trips that Father Bill wanted to go on to see some of these homesteads, because he used the county atlas and so forth. So we went down during the week to Strasbourg. And that was very interesting because the first place we stopped at Martens Blue Room, and he was very thirsty, it was warm, and he wanted to have a beer. So we had a beer there, and he was in seventh heaven because a lot of the guys were smoking, they were chewing snus. And he loved to do that. So, and they had the spittoons and everything. So, of course, you have to remember they still allowed smoking. So then, I'll never forget that, and so I introduced him, and then one guy came up to him, was not the owner, but one of the old German Russian fellows, say, by the way, Father, do you drink red eye? And he had no idea what red eye was. So, you have to remember he was Irish. So they had some red eye behind the counter. So I'll never forget that. So we had red eye, and I did not like red eye, but we had to drink about this much of it. So then he was hungry, and so we went over to someone I knew, and it was the first time that Father Bill was introduced. We had vegetable borscht soup, we had cheese buttons, placenta, and we had pickled watermelon. And I'll never forget that because that's what he said, that pickled watermelon. He said, can you get some more jars and we can take that home back to Fargo? So often when I would go home, and then he'd always ask, be sure you bring some of that German Kuchen and pickled watermelon back to Fargo. So he had a lot of introduction and many places where we visited. So I went with him 2 times. But the first time I went with him, we went out to the Welk homestead. You have to remember that was in bad shape at that time. Mike Welk, who lived at the house, moved to Strasbourg, and it was in disrepair to the point where it was almost going to be torn down. And thank God it didn't happen, because today it's a Welk Homestead State Historic Site. And that's one of the places where John Geraro, who would take most of the slides, and Father Bill would take the black and white prints, the pictures. So they took those. So we have those, and thank heavens, that's one of the sites. And in our collection, for the Father William C. Sherman collection, there's 13,000 images. Can you imagine that? Mostly of central and western North Dakota. They focus on Ukrainians, Hungarian Germans, and Germans from Russia. So you see many of those photographs are especially strong in western and southwestern North Dakota, because the homesteads were still standing. So that was one of the first visits that he made, but he was introduced, and that helped in the beginning of this amazing story. And of these 13,000 images, about 4,000 are on digital horizons, which you can see online. So, and from the exhibit that you see are from the digital horizons. So that was my introduction to Father Sherman. And then he would come, when he was pastor at St. Michael's Catholic Church in Grand Forks for 27 years, he would come down and teach twice a week sociology of the Great Plains. And then he would always come over to the GRHC, and we'd always go out and for lunch. So, and that's when he was so thrilled, because by that time, the German-Russian collection had started. And so he was thrilled. And so for him to see what happened, for his mentoring me, and today to know that we have this exhibit, And in this beautiful place, the home where he was pastor is truly an amazing story that I think that our dear Father Bill is looking down and saying, what did you do for us?
Quickly, I want everybody to know too that, the exhibit downstairs maybe has 25, 30 photos. 13,000 lives in my head. It was not an easy task finding all of those photos, but most of them live up here now, so I'm sure I could find a house and tell you probably about where it's at based on all of the images that I had to go through, but it was a great time. And I'm sure I'm in the minority here too, but I'm not German Russian. I don't know if that's true up on this stage, but I wanted to pass the mic over to Heather to introduce how you became interested in the German Russians and sort of your background in it.
Thank you. I am not German from Russia. I grew up on the Iron Range, northeast Minnesota, deep in mining country and surrounded by Finlanders. We were not Finnish, we were Norwegian, so we were always a bit of a misfit. However, I came to NDSU to study architecture, and there's two things I remember that really hit me when I came to NDSU. The first was every fall, there was this overwhelming sweet, sour smell in the air, and I couldn't put my finger on it until I realized it was the harvest season for the sugar beets. That was new to me. The second was this phrase, Germans from Russia. And I've always loved history. I consider myself somewhat of a history nerd, but I'd never heard Germans from Russia, and it seemed prolific, everyone. And I didn't know about it, and 4 years later, I started dating a gentleman, and as we're getting to know each other, we started talking about the families and maybe the size of the families, and he casually mentions that he has 92 cousins and 24 aunts and uncles, and I just laugh, thinking he was being funny, that's ridiculous. But then his face said he was serious, and I kind of offended him by laughing. But my family, my grandparents, either Lutheran or Methodist. I have 5 cousins total on one side. So it was a little hard to take. He can name all 92 cousins. Most of them are in western North Dakota. He is German from Russia, obviously. So that was my first introduction. The second part of this, I should mention, I ended up marrying him. So it's maybe somewhat official. However, my father-in-law, he put this together. It's the family heritage of the Fischer family. And he put this together before there were PCs. Yes. My husband, Dominic, said he and his siblings had to spend hours putting all of these in the little slides. But we're eventually going to digitize it. But this is his whole entire family heritage, going all the way back to the 1700s. It's a remarkable thing. And he just did it for fun in his off time. I just had never seen anything quite like that, and that is my cup of tea. I said I married into the right family. So that was one good way to reel me in. The second part was when I actually started to get more involved. I think it was 2015, and to me, Dr. Isern had always been somewhat of an icon for me. And he called me, I think he emailed me during the summer, and I immediately felt like the rock star had just emailed me and asked me if I wanted to go on a project to Zealand. And in my head, I'm like, I know he does projects in New Zealand. I'm like, yes, I'll go to New Zealand with you. That sounds great. No, not New Zealand, Zealand, North Dakota. Population 80. Oh, okay. I will also do that with you. That would be great. So he asked me to basically write the architectural description and visit Zeeland, North Dakota, so they could put their city hall as a National Register nomination. So we traveled out there together. That was my first real experience getting into the thick of German from Russia country. And it was a wonderful experience. And then after, when we finally got on the National Register, we had a party, went back to Zeeland with Michael Miller, who I knew of, but I had never been properly introduced. And this was a huge party. I think, 300 people? At least. The town is 80. 300 people had showed up. So you can imagine Michael Miller was very busy, right, promoting and selling the books, and he seemed a little bit overwhelmed, so I started helping, and then we got chatting, and then before I knew it, we just you had talked about the Sherman collection with me, and then I talked about my interest in historic preservation, and before we know it, we're just, planting little seeds of potentially what we could do. I had not taught a seminar yet in historic preservation, but I knew I wanted to set one up. So I think that was where the connection was made, really. Marrying into it, and then kind of happenstance from both Dr. Isern and then Michael Miller. I should also preface, Steve Martens was my mentor and professor in architecture, in the architecture department. So he really precedes both of these individuals in terms of planting the seed of historic preservation. I just want to note, as an architecture student, whenever my parents or their friends would ask, are you excited to design your own house someday? And I said, no, that sounds awful. That was my instinct, and I thought to myself, why am I being an architect then? Like, I shouldn't be here. But it wasn't until Steve Martens kind of planted this seed of historic preservation that I felt at home, that I belonged, and that was my space and my place as an architect. So thank you, Steve.
And I suppose in terms of generations of people interested in German-Russian history, I've had the privilege of going out on these field trips with you, which is sort of a long-tailed experience that it seems like a lot of people have had. So I wonder if you could talk about what you're doing in the architecture department and how you sort of play a role in continuing the preservation out in rural North Dakota.
Sure. So I think it was in maybe 2019 when I started to put together a seminar. It's a graduate seminar, and from conversations with Michael, I already knew I wanted to try to do some field work with the students. When Steve Martens would do field work studies with their students, and since he retired, no one had really been doing any kind of field work and field study and field measurements. So I felt like I was qualified to do that, and the students really needed that. Right? We can only spend so much time in theory and design on the computer, in studio, and to get them actually out on the ground doing field measurements was really, really important. Also, a lot of our work these days, we're starting to get into more restoration, working with existing buildings. So if they don't want to do field measurements, they're going to start pretty far behind. So I thought we need to get at least 15 students, that's the max, out to the western North Dakota, but also look at, start documenting some of, or touching base with Father Sherman's collection, right? It hadn't been really visited in 40, maybe 50 years. Based on the condition that he was documenting at the time, 50 years later, what do they look like? How many of them are still standing? So I talked to Michael about maybe, obviously I can't take 13,000 images and go through all of them, right? We just start to categorize and maybe find the most important one, the most important significance. So we determined that it was the Leininger Renner place, which was Lawrence Welk's wife, Fern, her homestead. So that was our first visit. And keep in mind, the students that go out there, most of them just sign up for like a basic historic preservation course. They have no idea what they're in for. First day of class, I think they just sign up because it works for their schedule, honestly. And then we start to talk about, most of them are from Minneapolis, not many are from North Dakota. They have not been past west, probably West Fargo. So I try to prepare them. And, they're ready for the adventure. They're excited about it. So, of course, the day that we go out there, we have to trek in. You can only get so far on dirt roads. And, of course, it had rained. So we had to park about half a mile away, walk in. And then they weren't prepared. As much as I prepared them, you got to dress appropriately. There's rattlesnakes potentially, just aware. And they're not. I said, no, we have to be careful. And the biggest gentleman there was terrified. He wouldn't move. He wouldn't go anywhere. The next night, he went to Shields, bought the biggest boots. Really just stood there, terrified. So I think if they're ready for the adventure, it's a wonderful experience. The unfortunate thing is I got one trip in, and then 2020 happened. So that put the whole trip on hiatus, and I was really hoping that I just wanted to see how long this would actually take to document one of these buildings, because we have a lot to do. So we go in with drones, do flyovers. We definitely parse it out in terms of actual field measurements. We take history, find out if there's any relatives still alive, start to do some research that way. So now we had a feel for it, and then 2020 happened, paused for 3 years, and then I just started again this past year, and now we're trying to cover more ground. So we're trying to cover more bases. This last fall, I went down to Mott, to the Stern House. We documented that. My sister-in-law, also German from Russia, she has 10 kids. She's on track. She's fine. They have a beautiful barn. We documented that. So, every fall we're trying to pinpoint more significant ones, more concentration of them, so we can start to cover more ground to start to assess how much maybe is lost or what's still there from Father Sherman's collection, just to update it. And the students, they just had to sign up for seminars this last week, and they said it's a hot button topic to try to get into the seminar. They start to refresh at 8 o'clock to try to get in. Now I'm getting emails like bribes, like what do I need to do to get into this course? So the word is out. It's a great field study, and the students are excited, finally, now that we can get back on the ground.
I was, as part of sort of this exhibit too, I was able to somehow convince Jeremy and Michael that I too should be able to go out and take some photos of some of these homesteads. And I said, well, we can show what the homesteads looked like now, right? 50 years later, after Father Sherman and Graybill had taken their photos, and so I also had the chance to go out visit 8 or 10 homesteads, and we had forgotten too that I was going out to western North Dakota, and so I took my little Pontiac Bonneville, which sits about 3-4 inches from the ground. So I got stuck a couple of times. I got chased by cows, which was a whole other ordeal, but it was definitely, and it was during the pandemic, so I had to go by myself. So I was great company, but it was a great time. Definitely a nice experience to get hands-on learning, even if I was out in the middle of a field and trying to figure things out on my own. But as part of as we're talking about preservation in general, I wonder, Isern, you've been with NDSU for a long time now, maybe not quite as long as Michael Miller, but I wonder what you can talk about as a land-grant institution, what is sort of NDSU's role in trying to help continue preservation in this state?
That would take all night, and there'd be a lot of technical aspects, legal aspects, educational aspects. But I'm going to return where Steve started us, this idea of relationships. All right. And by the way, Heather, this business of doctor, I know I'm like 50 years older than you, but this doctor business is turning into a pile of misht. But that story you told reminded me then of the importance of relationships. We went out there and we're doing documentation work on the Zealand Hall, and I went to church, you may remember that weekend, and I sat down to a lovely woman who's actually even older than I am, and she turned out her name was Schweigert. And it turns out she was the mother of the head football coach of an institution down river from here, which I have a hard time saying the name of without spitting. fast forward a little bit, and the nomination of the National Register of the Zeeland Hall had emerged from the desk of the Secretary of the Interior. We had the celebration out there with that big crowd, and that was, and I called her up. Can you get Bubba out here to the celebration, because he's the favorite son of Zeeland, North Dakota, and by God, he came. Not only that, he got up to the podium, and the man, this is the head coach of a Division I football team, got up to the podium talking about his boyhood in Zeeland, and he cried. But he was not alone, because probably of 300 people, there were 250 people crying. Now that's the business of relationships. And I'd call Bubba a friend down to present day, and I congratulate him frequently on victories, and I will on every victory, except if he ever, in an absolute moonshot, beat North Dakota State University. But I don't expect ever to live long enough to see that. Do you? But we have a trend in this country, in higher education, of reducing much of it to a transactional basis. It's credit hours, it's assessment of learning, it's courses taught by people who are transient part-timers, and turning advisement over to professionals so they don't have contact with the professionals. Enough of that. What made North Dakota State University a great university was relationships. And if we're going to do anything in the preservation of the physical culture of the Germans from Russia or all the other ethnic peoples of North Dakota, or the human culture, the history, the folkways, the folk music, it has to be about relationships. It has to be NDSU extension in every county in the state. It has to be people like Heather and Steve and Michael who are willing to go out there. By the way, Wyatt, never travel with Michael Miller. You can't get anywhere. You get into German-Russian country, every corner you come to, Michael says, "Oh, stop here a minute, that's my cousin." And then eventually you can get away, perhaps in time for supper. But that is what role a place like a university plays. Because like in the days of Father Bill, those kids come here from every corner of the state, and they fell under his influence. And that was a tie that lasted. They never forgot studying the history of the Great Plains with Father Bill, and they carried it back. And why do I know they never forgot? Because they tell me about him. I remember, there was that old priest, what was his name? Yeah. Well, that wasn't a very good student because he didn't remember his professor's name, but the rest of them all remembered. Let us never cease that, and let the torch drop when someone like Michael Miller is ready to pass it on to another generation, and let us be carriers that pass it on to this generation, and then you do it again.
If I could add something. So going back to Zeeland and going to church, I remember now when we went down there, we went down a day early, and we were going to have kind of a gathering of stories. We invited the community to do some storytelling, but we need to make sure people were actually going to show up. We didn't know if anyone was going to show up the next day, so we're thinking how we can gather the people. It was a Saturday and then Sunday the next day, and you were going to go to the Lutheran church. I thought, well, if you're hitting up the Lutheran church, I'll go to the Catholic church, and then we'll just bring the people with us. And that's essentially what we did. And we got some really great stories. I had a lovely conversation with a lady who, her and her sister married two brothers on the same day, and they both had the same church ceremony, and they went down and had the huge dance hall filled with like 500 people. So all of these stories, just because, I mean, we knew where the people were, we went to the people, and we wanted to make sure we could get as many stories and diverse stories as possible. So just knowing where the people are and knowing how to reach them and show them that we're, not necessarily high-minded people from the East, maybe we are a little bit, but genuinely curious and want to hear the stories. I think it's a sincerity that they want to see if your boots are on the ground. I think that makes a big difference in getting those stories.
And we've had, conversations about how to increase the German-Russian audience, right? Because we, as much as we appreciate all actual German Russians and the heritage that they collect, we also want to share these stories with people who might not know anything about the German Russian community. I was one of those before I was lucky enough to start working at the GRHC. I hadn't heard of anything. So I was sort of dropped into this world that I didn't really understand, but found out pretty quickly that there were countless people who had dedicated their life to their own family history, German Russian history in general, and we're trying to figure out ways, all of us, how to get these stories out to a wider audience. And so I wonder if Steve and Heather, you could sort of talk about your role in trying to increase access to whether it be preservation projects in general or just cultural heritage. So the role of technology or even just any sort of outreach programs that you're doing.
Well, several things about your question kind of registered with me. I was thinking about, we're in an age where everybody is so infatuated with virtual reality and pseudo-intelligence or AI. And, I think the point that has been made by everyone here is that the real experience of being in these places and talking with people who live in these landscapes, it impacts you in a way that seeing pictures of it or reading about something in a book just can't. I mean, the real experience of standing on the ground in that tall grass out there and worrying about what's going to appear, and going to local taverns with people that have lived their whole lives in those places, you see and understand a place in a much different way. Lou Hoffermill was director of historic preservation at the State Historical Society, and asked if I could round up a group of students to go out and do measured drawings of the Hutmacher property. And they ended up doing a set of historic American building survey drawings that are in the Library of Congress right now. And it had such a transformative effect on those students who all came from East River, one from here in the valley and two from the Twin Cities. And they said, as soon as they got west of Fargo, it's like a whole new world opened to their eyes. And they really fell in love with this place. And they fell in love with the communities that they found out there. I think that was part of the appeal for Father Sherman attracting NDSU architecture students in particular to go out and be involved with him. In the 60s, that idea of community and community service and sociology of how people live together, that was those behavioral things were something that fascinated all students. And I was introduced to Father Sherman's work from Rick Ingebretson and Tom Hofferber, who were some of his assistants along the way. Leo Kim became an internationally famous documentary film photographer, art photography and gallery photography, and he was part of those tours. So, maybe it's not everyone who is drawn to places like this, but I think it's a damn sight better than virtual reality, than wearing a headset around all the time and only knowing the world based on what somebody programs into your way of seeing and understanding. So I was also thinking a little bit, as folks were talking about, I think these topics, one of the remarkable things is how periodically, a couple times each year, some new product comes out that puts this heritage, gives it visibility and puts it on the radar screen of people. And I think the gallery exhibit is one of those things that hopefully that'll attract enough interest that Jeremy you'll be running ragged trying to serve all the people that call and want information or want to make those connections. I was thinking about it, it's sort of like that exhibit is the gateway drug for Germans from Russia heritage culture. Or maybe another way of saying it is that it opens the door to people, or opens the Vorhausel to people to want to come in and see what this is all about. So keeping that door open and welcoming people into understanding this. My last thought about all of that is that when I went back, it's been a while since I looked at some of the information from the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, and so I went back and reread the books, and the thing that Father Sherman did particularly well was understanding people from all kinds of traditions that were different from his own tradition, and they could be people of different faiths and so forth, and yet he gave a fatherly treatment of understanding what made those communities different from the Catholic Germans from Russia communities. So I think that kind of comparative way of understanding the world based on the differences from one group to another. And lastly about all that, when I revisited these things, I was interested in some of the documentation from the Flickr collections from the Tours of the Homeland. And in light of the pictures that we see almost every night on the evening news of the destruction that's happening in the Black Sea region in Ukraine and Bessarabian region, to see how much of that heritage translated directly to here. I mean, the correspondence and construction methods and the form of the houses, buildings that were over there, they were made the way they were made because that was a good working solution to a particular kind of landscape, to the requirements of the environment, to the resources and materials that were available. It was an architecture that was embedded in a certain kind of place, and I think it's perfectly embedded in this landscape where we are today. And we can learn so much. I'm always struck by seeing refugee families leaving into Poland from Ukraine, and how civilized and cultured and what good people they are. Essentially, the love that goes along with the place that they are from and caring for one's neighbors. And it's, I just can't imagine seeing a family from, our country being faced with having to make a relocation like that and doing it so graciously and so caringly and with such kindness and courtesy toward neighbors. So I think all of those things are embedded in this place, and what makes, Bill Peterson, the director of the State Historical Society, says he thinks he won the lottery when he got the opportunity to come here, because there is more heritage to be documented in North Dakota than anywhere else in the United States. More archaeological investigation to be made, more cultural heritage investigation, and we all hit the lottery by winding up here. I think I've wound up here. I'm pretty sure I'm old enough that I'm not going anyplace else. It's one of the real privileges of our lives to be able to associate with people who care about place and neighbors, and have a chance to work with people whose business is to celebrate that, to cultivate those relationships.
I want to mention, you're probably not aware of this, but in June of 1994, myself and others, we went over to Odessa, Ukraine to visit these former German villages because we want to explore the idea of having what we call the Journey to the Homeland tours. So from 1996 until 2019, 23 tours we went to Germany, Ukraine, and I'm so pleased today we have many here who are sitting here who are on those tours. But one of the first ones to join me on the tour was in May of 1996, was Millie Dole Haug from Richardson, North Dakota. Stand up, Millie. Millie's in her 90s, and thank God she's here with her family staying with her family in Fargo, but she told me, she says, I'm going back to Richardson for the summer. But what's so interesting about this was because then when I came back in June of 1994, then Father Bill asked me a lot of questions about visiting these villages near the Black Sea and the former Bessarabia. So what happened was, in September 1995 and in September 1997, Father Bill and John Geraro flew to Odessa, Ukraine, and visited these villages. And from that, many of you are not aware of this, but there's, in our German-Russian collection, in the Father William Sherman, photograph collection, there are hundreds of color slides of visiting these villages. He was especially interested in the structure and the architecture, the fences and the landscape, the churches and so forth. So one of my dreams is that all of these photographs have already been digitized, but our plan is to place these photographs at Digital Horizons, and then we want to develop a traveling exhibit like you see downstairs. So I think this would really be of interest because it's going to have the names of like Strasbourg, Sels, Kundl, Karlsruhe, Leipzig, Kulm, all these village names is where he visited, and he has all these slides. And of course, we have hundreds of slides from our homeland tours. So I think this could generate a new interesting audience, and we hope that when we have this traveling exhibit, we can have this beautiful facility and have it the premiere here at the Newman Center.
So, as you were talking about that, Michael, I was sort of reminded on one of the biggest draws for this exhibit that I was interested in is the idea of historic preservation. Heather helped me a lot with that. I was able to take a class from her. But not just about physical preservation, right? And we talked about how in the exhibit, over 50% of the homes that Father Sherman had documented in the 1970s are now, as far as we know, gone. And we don't, whether it is human destruction or natural destruction, right? The forces of time sort of take their toll on these buildings, even though they have withstood plenty of years. A lot of them now are sort of gone. And, we've had the luxury of having people like Father Sherman document them, and now it seems a lot of us are trying to play catch-up, trying to do as much as we can before we do start to lose some of these homesteads, because we can only save so many of them, and only so many of them can end up being on the National Register or becoming state historic sites. But there's a lot of history and culture out there in these buildings, whether they're occupied still or not. And I wanted to ask you, Heather, sort of maybe how you have used the role of technology, but also just how your work is sort of a continuation of preservation and how we might be able to make it more accessible to a wider audience.
That's a good question. So actually, while Steve was talking, he had mentioned that the Germans from Russia had brought over their construction methodologies that worked very well in the home country, but brought them over, which also worked very well here. So I thought, when I'm doing these field studies with students, yes, it is about getting them experience of field measurements, but thinking past that. So usually the first day of class, I ask them why they took the seminar. Maybe one, because they're interested in historic preservation. Otherwise, they've never thought of historic preservation. So my goal is always by the end that they have a more invested understanding of it going forward as architects. The last 15, 20 years has been this huge push for green design, right, LEED design. They feel like they have to get their LEED certification, otherwise they're invaluable. There's a time and a place for green design, green buildings, but I'm always catching them, and always a big proponent of saying the greenest building out there is an existing building. Right? Any type of new technology, new materials, LEED certification, it cannot compete with something that's existing already. The embodied energy is already there, and it's enough to keep them kind of questioning this idea of all these new technologies and methods can only get you so far. And if we start to actually look at the resources that are existing, so that's why going to these field sites, we can also look at the construction methodologies going forward. Obviously, we cannot save them, but we can learn a lot about how they use those materials. There's kind of a new term these days called critical regionalism in architecture, and it's understanding that I think there's this transition now, and maybe because of COVID, I'm not sure, maybe partially, that it's a concept that seeks to balance local needs and capabilities with the progression of modernization. So understanding, what we have available at the local level, which is exactly what the Germans from Russia did. Right? They could see a lot of similar materials on the ground using what's there on hand. So my hope is that the students can look at the methodologies, but also knowing we have to adapt them for modernization, right? If it's going to be reasonable as architects. And I think they start to do that and understand, I think, the ability from after this course going forward, there's actually been a number of students that have gone on and get masters in historic preservation. So it's just planting that seed, getting them on the ground, and also questioning maybe a lot of these new fancy tools and methods that actually aren't going to be around that long. Right? These are resources and materials that are locally found for a reason, and it makes the project that more accessible, I think. And we're entering, I think, a new phase of design and architecture where we're starting to look at existing buildings in a different way. And I'm glad that we're starting to plant these little seeds for the next generation to take it over.
All right, can we give one more round of applause for our panel? I wanted to just make a couple more comments. The exhibit downstairs that you saw is thanks to a generous donation from the Blair Flagel Estate at the recommendation of Jim and Tom Brousseau, and will be on display here at the Newman Center until May 18th. And then it will travel this summer and be in Rugby for the duration of the summer at the Prairie Village Museum. I'm excited to announce that we recently received a donation from the Mike and Peggy Bullinger family to produce a identical exhibit that will be in Medora for the entire summer as well. So this exhibit will be seen by thousands of visitors to North Dakota, and we're excited for that. More details about that will come soon. If you would like to support exhibits and events like this in the future, I would encourage you to become a friend of the libraries. You can visit the library table out here. Also, the NDSU Press has a table here with some of the books that Father Sherman did and a lot of books about the topics you've heard about tonight, so please visit their table and purchase some books.